Girl returns from death with a terrifying prophecy about the future. The water was so cold it felt like knives piercing her skin. One moment, she had been staring at the bright sky above the riverbank, her laughter ringing out as she played with her friends. The next, she was underwater, struggling against the current that wrapped around her like an icy grip. Sarah gasped, clawing at the surface, but the river seemed to pull her deeper with every desperate movement. Her lungs burned, her vision blurred, and for a brief, terrifying moment, everything went silent. Then came the light. It wasn't the kind of light Sarah had expected, not warm, not inviting. It was jagged, harsh, and unyielding. The world around her dissolved, replaced by a swirling landscape of ash-gray skies and barren wastelands. Fires raged across crumbled cities, their flames licking at the edges of towering waves that crashed mercilessly against abandoned shorelines. A thick, suffocating smog hung in the air, blotting out the horizon. Sarah tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive void. A cacophony of sounds filled her head, sirens wailing, voices crying out in desperation, and something else. A deep, guttural roar, almost mechanical, like the earth itself was crying in agony. And then she saw them. Towering figures stood among the ruins, their bodies obscured by flickering shadows and streaks of firelight. Their faces were human yet grotesque, warped as though reflecting the sins of mankind. One figure stepped forward, its presence suffocating. Its mouth didn't move, yet Sarah could hear its voice, clear and deafening, resonating within her skull. "See what they have wrought," it said, its tone neither angry nor sorrowful, but final. "See the future they have chosen." Images flashed before her eyes. Crops withering under relentless heat. Oceans devouring coastal cities. Factories billowing smoke that choked the skies. And among it all, the people, clinging to their power, their greed, their denial as the world collapsed around them. And then she saw him. Trump. He sat in a gleaming office, surrounded by wealth and grandeur, his expression impassive as reports of disasters scrolled across a screen in front of him. A map on the wall behind him showed the world divided, fractured into pieces. His hand hovered over a stack of papers stamped with seals and signatures, each one tied to policies that the Watchers said were accelerants. "It cannot be undone," the figure said, its fiery eyes locking onto Sarah's. "But it can be mitigated. The choice lies with them." With a sudden jolt, Sarah felt herself pulled backward, the fiery ruins and haunting figures fading into the darkness. The light disappeared, replaced by the cold, familiar sensation of water. Her eyes shot open, and she was coughing, gasping for air, her body trembling as hands pulled her onto the riverbank. She could hear voices, her friends shouting, her mother crying, but it all sounded distant, muffled. She sat up slowly, her body heavy with exhaustion, and looked around. Everything felt too bright, too loud, too alive. Her mother knelt beside her, clutching her face with trembling hands. "Sarah," she cried. "Oh my God, Sarah, are you okay?" But Sarah couldn't answer. Her mind was still in the void, still staring into the fiery eyes of the Watcher. "I saw something," she whispered, her voice barely audible. What are you talking about?" her mother asked, panic and confusion etched across her face. Sarah turned to look at her, her eyes wide and filled with something that wasn't quite fear but wasn't far from it either. "The future," she said. "I saw the future." Her friends exchanged uneasy glances, their laughter and relief evaporating into an awkward silence. Her mother's grip tightened on her shoulders. "Sarah, honey, you're in shock," she said. "You almost drowned. You're confused?" "No," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "I saw it. The fires. The floods. The cities falling apart. And there were these beings. They showed me everything. They said it's already happening. That we caused it." Her mother frowned, clearly unsettled, but she tried to keep her voice calm. "Sweetheart, let's get you home. We can talk about this later." But Sarah wasn't listening. She stood, her legs shaky but determined, and looked at the river. It seemed so calm now, its surface glittering in the sunlight, as though mocking her. "They said there's still a chance," she murmured. "But we have to change. If we don't, Her voice trailed off, the weight of the Watcher's warning settling heavily on her chest. Sarah sat in the back seat of the car, staring blankly out the window as her mother drove them home. The radio played softly, some cheery pop song that felt utterly out of place after what she had just experienced. Her hands rested on her lap, trembling slightly, and her breath was shallow, as if the weight of the vision still clung to her chest. "Are you sure you're feeling okay, sweetheart?" her mother asked for the 5th time, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Her voice was soft, careful, but the worry was impossible to hide. "We can go to the hospital if you need." Sarah shook her head. "I'm fine," she said quietly, though the words felt hollow. How could she explain what she had seen? How could she make her mother understand when she barely understood herself? The fiery landscapes, the Watchers, the images of destruction, all of it felt too massive, too incomprehensible. Yet it was seared into her memory, more vivid than anything she had ever experienced. As the car turned onto their street, the familiar sight of their modest home came into view, but it felt different now. The neatly trimmed lawn, the colorful flowers lining the walkway, it all seemed so fragile, so temporary. She thought of the barren wastelands she had seen, of the ash and ruin, and a shiver ran down her spine. Her mother parked the car and turned to face her, her eyes searching Sarah's face for answers. "Honey," she said gently, "I know something's bothering you. You can talk to me. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together, okay?" Sarah hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. She wanted to tell her mother everything, to unload the terrifying burden that was now hers to carry. But how could she? How could she put into words the magnitude of what she had seen? I need to write it down," she said finally. "Everything I saw. I need to remember it all before it fades." Her mother frowned but nodded slowly. She said, "Take your time. I'll be in the kitchen if you need me." Sarah climbed out of the car, her legs still shaky, and made her way inside. The house was quiet, the air filled with the faint smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. Normally, it would have comforted her, but now it felt oppressive, like the calm before a storm. She went straight to her room and closed the door, grabbing her notebook and a pen from her desk. Her hands trembled as she flipped to a blank page and began to write, the words spilling out in a frantic scrawl. Fires consuming the cities. The sky black with ash. Oceans swallowing the land. The Watchers standing in the ruins, their eyes like burning coals. They said it was our fault. All of it. Greed, power, denial, these are the things that killed the world. I saw him. Trump. He was there, surrounded by gold and papers. They said his choices rippled out, like stones thrown into water, making everything worse. But it's not just him. It's all of us. They showed me the future, and it's already happening. She paused, her hand cramping from the speed of her writing, and stared at the page. The words looked foreign to her, like they had been written by someone else. But they were hers. They were real. A knock at the door startled her, and she quickly closed the notebook, shoving it under her pillow. "Come in," she called, her voice shaky. Her mother stepped inside, holding a glass of water. "I thought you might need this," she said, setting it down on the desk. Her eyes flicked to the notebook, but she didn't comment on it. "Do you want to talk now?" Sarah hesitated, her fingers brushing against the edge of the notebook. "I saw something," she said finally. When I was in the river. I don't know if it was real, but it felt real." Her mother sat down on the edge of the bed, her expression patient. "What did you see?" she asked gently. Sarah took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "I saw the future," she said. "I saw cities burning, oceans flooding the land, everything falling apart. There were these beings. They said it was because of us. Because of the way we've treated the world." Her mother's face twisted with concern, but she didn't interrupt. Sarah pressed on, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "They showed me him," she said. "Trump. They said his choices, his greed, his policies, they're like poison. But they also said it's not just him. It's all of us. Every time we ignore what's happening, every time we choose convenience over responsibility, we're making it worse." Her mother's lips parted, but no words came out. Finally, she managed, "Sarah, honey, that sounds terrifying." But maybe it was just a bad dream. You went through something traumatic. It wasn't a dream, Sarah said firmly. It was real. I can still feel it like it's burned into me. And they told me I have to warn people. That's why I came back. Her mother stared at her, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You're so young, she whispered. You shouldn't have to carry something like this. I don't have a choice, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. They showed me what happens if we don't listen. If we don't change. Her mother reached out, pulling her into a tight hug. We'll figure it out, she said, her voice trembling. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. But as Sarah clung to her mother, she couldn't shake the feeling that the weight of the prophecy was hers alone to bear. Sarah sat in the back seat of the car, staring blankly out the window as her mother drove them home. The radio played softly, some cheery pop song that felt utterly out of place after what she had just experienced. Her hands rested on her lap, trembling slightly, and her breath was shallow, as if the weight of the vision still clung to her chest. Are you sure you're feeling okay, sweetheart? Her mother asked for the 5th time, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. Her voice was soft, careful, but the worry was impossible to hide. We can go to the hospital if you need. Sarah shook her head. I'm fine, she said quietly, though the words felt hollow. How could she explain what she had seen? How could she make her mother understand when she barely understood herself? The fiery landscapes, the watchers, the images of destruction, all of it felt too massive, too incomprehensible. Yet it was seared into her memory, more vivid than anything she had ever experienced. As the car turned onto their street, the familiar sight of their modest home came into view, but it felt different now. The neatly trimmed lawn, the colorful flowers lining the walkway, it all seemed so fragile, so temporary. She thought of the barren wastelands she had seen, of the ash and ruin, and a shiver ran down her spine. Her mother parked the car and turned to face her, her eyes searching Sarah's face for answers. Honey, she said gently, I know something's bothering you. You can talk to me. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together, okay? Sarah hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. She wanted to tell her mother everything, to unload the terrifying burden that was now hers to carry. But how could she? How could she put into words the magnitude of what she had seen? I need to write it down, she said finally. Everything I saw. I need to remember it all before it fades. Her mother frowned but nodded slowly. She said, take your time. I'll be in the kitchen if you need me. Sarah climbed out of the car, her legs still shaky, and made her way inside. The house was quiet, the air filled with the faint smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. Normally, it would have comforted her, but now it felt oppressive, like the calm before a storm. She went straight to her room and closed the door, grabbing her notebook and a pen from her desk. Her hands trembled as she flipped to a blank page and began to write, the words spilling out in a frantic scrawl. Fires consuming the cities. The sky black with ash. Oceans swallowing the land. The watchers standing in the ruins, their eyes like burning coals. They said it was our fault. All of it. Greed, power, denial, these are the things that killed the world. I saw him. Trump. He was there, surrounded by gold and papers. They said his choices rippled out, like stones thrown into water, making everything worse. But it's not just him. It's all of us. They showed me the future, and it's already happening. She paused, her hand cramping from the speed of her writing, and stared at the page. The words looked foreign to her, like they had been written by someone else. But they were hers. They were real. A knock at the door startled her, and she quickly closed the notebook, shoving it under her pillow. Come in, she called, her voice shaky. Her mother stepped inside, holding a glass of water. I thought you might need this, she said, setting it down on the desk. Her eyes flicked to the notebook, but she didn't comment on it. Do you want to talk now? Sarah hesitated, her fingers brushing against the edge of the notebook. I saw something, she said finally. When I was in the river. I don't know if it was real, but it felt real. Her mother sat down on the edge of the bed, her expression patient. What did you see? She asked gently. Sarah took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. I saw the future, she said. I saw cities burning, oceans flooding the land, everything falling apart. There were these beings. They said it was because of us. Because of the way we've treated the world. Her mother's face twisted with concern, but she didn't interrupt. Sarah pressed on, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. They showed me him, she said. Trump. They said his choices, his greed, his policies, they're like poison. But they also said it's not just him. It's all of us. Every time we ignore what's happening, every time we choose convenience over responsibility, we're making it worse. Her mother's lips parted, but no words came out. Finally, she managed, Sarah, honey, that sounds terrifying. But maybe it was just a bad dream. You went through something traumatic. It wasn't a dream, Sarah said firmly. It was real. I can still feel it like it's burned into me. And they told me I have to warn people. That's why I came back. Her mother stared at her, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. You're so young, she whispered. You shouldn't have to carry something like this. I don't have a choice, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. They showed me what happens if we don't listen. If we don't change. Her mother reached out, pulling her into a tight hug. We'll figure it out, she said, her voice trembling. Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together. But as Sarah clung to her mother, she couldn't shake the feeling that the weight of the prophecy was hers alone to bear. Sarah spent the next few days consumed by a single purpose. She had to find a way to make people believe her. It wasn't enough to scribble warnings in her notebook or whisper her fears to her mother. The Watchers had entrusted her with a terrifying truth, and she could feel the weight of their urgency pressing down on her. But the real world didn't make it easy. Her friends avoided her now, their smiles awkward, their conversations cut short whenever she approached. Even her teachers seemed to tread lightly around her, as if she were made of glass. Her mother tried to be supportive, but the worry in her eyes spoke volumes. Every time Sarah opened her mouth to talk about the vision, the same response followed. Maybe you just need to rest, sweetheart. Rest? How could she rest when the future was unraveling before her eyes? Late one evening, Sarah sat alone in her room, the dim light of her desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The notebook lay open in front of her, its pages filled with frantic sketches and notes. She had drawn the Watchers again and again, their fiery eyes and distorted faces haunting her dreams. The words of the prophecy replayed in her mind like a broken record, each repetition adding to her desperation. Her gaze fell on the corner of the notebook, where she had written a single name in bold, jagged letters, Trump. The Watchers had made it clear that he wasn't the root of the problem, but he was a catalyst. His decisions, his policies, they rippled outward, affecting everything. She had seen it in the vision, factories spewing toxic smoke, forests stripped bare, oceans rising to swallow entire cities. And yet, in the vision, he sat untouched, surrounded by wealth and power, oblivious to the chaos he had unleashed. Sarah clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. People have to see it, she muttered to herself. They have to understand what's coming. But how? How could she convince anyone when they dismissed her as a traumatized kid with an overactive imagination? Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a notification from the local news app. She unlocked the screen and froze as she read the headline. Unprecedented wildfires devastate western states. Experts warn of accelerating climate crisis. Her heart raced as she scrolled through the article. The images were eerily similar to what she had seen in her vision. Entire neighborhoods reduced to ash, orange skies choking on smoke. The words of the Watchers echoed in her mind. It's already happening. She had to do something. She couldn't sit by and watch the prophecy unfold. But what could a 14-year-old girl do against something so massive, so unstoppable? The answer came to her in a flash of clarity. She couldn't stop the future alone, but she could start with the people who could. The next day, Sarah stood in front of her school's auditorium, clutching a stack of papers in her hands. She had spent the entire night researching, printing out articles, and piecing together every scrap of evidence she could find. The wildfires, the floods, the policies, they were all connected, all leading to the future the Watchers had shown her. Her hands trembled as she scanned the crowd of students and teachers. The assembly had been called for a guest speaker, But Sarah had convinced the principal to give her 5 minutes to speak beforehand. She knew it wasn't much, but it was a start. When the microphone crackled to life, Sarah took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Hi," she began, her voice shaky but determined. "My name is Sarah, and I need to tell you something important. Something terrifying." The room fell silent, all eyes on her. She could feel the weight of their skepticism, the unspoken question. What could she possibly have to say that mattered? "I know you've all heard about the wildfires out west," she continued. "About the floods, the hurricanes, the heat waves. They keep calling it a crisis, but no one's talking about what it really is. It's a warning." She held up one of the articles she had printed, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. "This isn't normal. None of this is normal. And it's not just nature, it's us. The way we live, the choices we make. Every time we ignore it, every time we choose greed over responsibility, we make it worse." A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Sarah pressed on. "I know this sounds crazy, but I saw it. I saw the future, and it's worse than anything you can imagine. Cities burning, oceans swallowing entire countries, people fighting over scraps. And it's not just random, it's because of people like..." She hesitated, her gaze falling to the papers in her hands. "It's because of people in power who refuse to see what's right in front of them. People like Trump." The name hung in the air like a thunderclap, the murmurs growing louder. Sarah's pulse quickened, but she refused to back down. "I'm not saying he's the only problem," she said. "But his decisions, his policies, they're making everything worse. And if we don't stop this now, if we don't change, it's going to be too late." The principal stepped forward, his expression a mix of alarm and disapproval. "Sarah, I think that's enough." "No," Sarah said, her voice rising. "It's not enough. It's never enough. That's why this is happening. Because people keep saying it's enough when it isn't." The crowd erupted into chaos, students whispering, teachers trying to restore order. Sarah's chest heaved as she stared at the microphone, the words still burning in her throat. She knew she hadn't convinced them, not yet. But she had planted the seed, and that was all she needed. As she walked off the stage, her mother met her at the edge of the auditorium, her face pale but resolute. "We'll figure out the next step," Linda said quietly, her hand on Sarah's shoulder. "We'll make them see." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding. The watchers had given her a message, and she wasn't going to stop until the world listened. Sarah's words hung in the air like an invisible fog, trailing behind her as she walked out of the auditorium with her mother. The chaotic murmurs of the crowd still echoed in her ears, a mix of disbelief, ridicule, and a few faint whispers of intrigue. She wasn't sure if anyone would believe her, but she had said it. The truth was out there now, even if it was wrapped in doubt. Her mother's grip on her shoulder tightened as they stepped into the car. "Are you okay?" Linda asked, her voice a mix of concern and pride. "I don't know," Sarah admitted, sinking into the passenger seat. Her hands were still shaking from the adrenaline, and her throat felt raw. "I had to say it. I don't know if it'll be enough." Linda sighed, starting the car. "You're brave, Sarah. So much braver than I think I could ever be. But you can't expect everyone to understand right away. People are scared of change, and they don't like hearing things that make them uncomfortable." "They should be scared," Sarah said, staring out the window. "If they saw what I saw, they wouldn't waste another second ignoring it." As they drove through the quiet streets of their small town, Sarah's mind raced. Her speech had been impulsive, fueled by raw emotion and fear, but it hadn't been enough. She needed more, something bigger, something undeniable. The watchers had shown her the future, and the urgency of their warning burned inside her like a fire. If she didn't act now, it would be too late. That night, Sarah sat at her desk, her notebook open to a blank page. She flipped through the earlier entries, her shaky handwriting detailing every horrific vision she had seen. Fires consuming cities. Oceans devouring the land. People screaming, fighting, collapsing under the weight of their own choices. And at the center of it all, the watchers, their fiery eyes watching silently as the world unraveled. But there was one image that haunted her more than anything else. Trump. His face had been clear in the vision, as if the watchers wanted her to see him, to understand his role in the disaster. He wasn't just a leader making bad decisions. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong. Greed, denial, hubris. And yet, the Watchers hadn't blamed him entirely. They had said the fault was collective, that every choice rippled outward, creating consequences beyond comprehension. Sarah grabbed her pen and began to write, her thoughts spilling onto the page in a frenzy of urgency. People won't listen to words. They need proof. They need to see it happening. The Watchers showed me what's coming, but no one will believe me unless I can connect it to now. To something real. She paused, staring at the words. Proof. That was what she needed. Something tangible, something undeniable. But how could she prove something that hadn't happened yet? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing on the desk. She picked it up and saw a news alert flashing on the screen. Her breath caught as she read the headline. Severe flooding strikes coastal cities. Experts say it's just the beginning. The article included photos of submerged streets, cars floating like toys in murky water, and people wading through waist-deep floods with desperation etched on their faces. Sarah's heart pounded as she scrolled through the images. It was exactly what she had seen in her vision. Oceans rising, swallowing the land, leaving destruction in their wake. Her hands trembled as she opened her notebook again, flipping to a page where she had sketched the scene from her vision. The similarities were undeniable. The Watchers had shown her this, and now it was happening. This is it, she whispered to herself. This is the proof. She ran to the living room, clutching the notebook in her hands. Mom, she called out, her voice trembling with urgency. You need to see this. Linda looked up from the couch, startled. What is it, Sarah? Sarah held up the notebook, flipping to the page with the sketch. Look at this, she said, pointing to the image. I drew this the night I came back. I saw it in the vision. And now look at this. She handed her phone to Linda, showing her the photos of the flooding. Linda's eyes widened as she compared the two. Sarah, she said slowly, this is eerie. But it could just be a coincidence. It's not a coincidence, Sarah interrupted, her voice rising. The Watchers showed me this. They said it would happen, and now it's happening. Don't you see? This is what I have to warn people about. Linda hesitated, her face a mixture of disbelief and unease. Okay, she said finally. Let's say you're right. What do you want to do about it? Sarah took a deep breath, her mind racing. I need to reach more people. Not just the school. Everyone. If they don't believe me, they'll believe this. She held up the notebook and the phone. I have to find a way to show them. Linda nodded slowly, her expression resolute. Then we'll figure it out together. The next morning, Sarah sat in the back seat of the car as her mother drove them into the city. They were headed to a local news station, where Linda had managed to secure a meeting with a journalist she knew from college. Sarah's notebook rested on her lap, the weight of its contents heavier than ever. As they approached the city, Sarah's stomach churned with a mix of nerves and determination. This was her chance to make people listen, to make them see. But what if it wasn't enough? What if the world ignored her warning, just as they always ignored the signs? The car came to a stop outside the news station, and Linda turned to her. Are you ready? She asked. Sarah nodded, clutching the notebook tightly. I have to be. As they stepped inside, the fluorescent lights and bustling energy of the newsroom felt overwhelming. Journalists hurried back and forth, their voices blending into a symphony of chaos. Sarah followed her mother to a desk where a man in a crisp suit sat typing furiously on his computer. David, Linda said, catching his attention. This is my daughter, Sarah. She has something you need to see. David raised an eyebrow, his skeptical gaze shifting to Sarah. All right, he said, leaning back in his chair. Let's see what you've got. Sarah took a deep breath, opening her notebook and placing it on the desk in front of him. This isn't just a story, she said. It's a warning. And if people don't listen, it's going to be too late. David leaned forward, flipping through the pages of Sarah's notebook with a mixture of intrigue and skepticism. The sketches caught his eye first, raw, jagged lines depicting fiery landscapes, rising waters, and towering, shadowy figures with eyes that seemed to burn through the page. his brows furrowed as he scanned the hastily scribbled notes accompanying each image. "These are intense," he said, glancing up at Sarah. "You're saying you saw all of this?" "I didn't just see it," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the knot in her stomach. "I lived it. The Watchers showed me everything. The floods, the fires, the destruction. They said it's already happening." David leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the edge of his desk. "Look, kid, I'm not saying I don't believe you, but, well, you have to understand how this sounds. A vision of the future? From heaven? That's not exactly something I can take to my editor without some serious evidence." Sarah's hands tightened into fists. She had known this would be an uphill battle, but the dismissal still stung. "It's not just a vision," she said, her voice rising. "The floods are happening now. Look at the news. The fires, the hurricanes, the heat waves, it's all connected. The Watchers said these were the warnings, and if we don't act, it's only going to get worse." David sighed, glancing at Linda, who was watching the exchange with a mixture of worry and determination. "Linda, I respect you, and I know you wouldn't bring this to me if it wasn't important, but this is a lot." "David," Linda said, her tone steady but pleading, "just listen to her. She's not making this up. She's been through something extraordinary, and if there's even a chance she's right, don't you think people need to hear it?" David rubbed his temples, clearly torn. Finally, he leaned forward, his gaze locking onto Sarah's. He said, "Let's say for a second that I believe you. What do you want me to do about it? Run a story? Broadcast these drawings? You need more than just words and sketches, kid. You need something concrete. Something undeniable." Sarah hesitated, her mind racing. What more could she give him? The Watchers hadn't left her with physical evidence, only their warning, seared into her memory like a scar. But then she remembered the photos on her phone, the articles about the floods and fires that mirrored her vision almost exactly. "Here," she said, pulling out her phone and scrolling to the images. "Look at this. I drew this weeks ago, right after I came back. And now it's happening. The floods, the wildfires, it's all in the news. This isn't just some coincidence." David took the phone, his expression shifting as he compared the photos to Sarah's sketches. For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. "Okay," he said slowly, "this is compelling, but it's still circumstantial. People are going to say you just copied what you saw in the news." Sarah's frustration boiled over. "That's because they don't want to believe it," she snapped. "They don't want to admit that we're running out of time, that our choices are killing the planet. But the Watchers said I have to warn people. If you don't help me, who will?" David stared at her, his pen frozen in midair. The conviction in her voice was unshakable, and for a moment he found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was more to her story than he had given her credit for. "All right," he said finally, "I'll give you a chance. We'll run a segment, just a short one. But you have to understand, if people don't take this seriously, it could backfire. They'll dismiss you as some crazy kid, and you'll lose whatever credibility you have." Sarah nodded, her jaw set. "I don't care what they think of me. As long as they listen." The newsroom buzzed with activity as David prepared the segment. Sarah sat in a chair off to the side, her notebook clutched tightly in her hands. Linda sat beside her, offering quiet words of encouragement, but Sarah barely heard them. Her mind was focused, her heart pounding with a mix of nerves and determination. When it was finally time, David guided her to a small studio where a camera crew was waiting. The bright lights and polished set felt surreal, almost overwhelming, but Sarah pushed the feeling aside. This was her moment, her chance to make people see the truth. The camera operator counted down, and the red light blinked on. David introduced the segment, his tone professional but measured, and then turned to Sarah. "Sarah, you've claimed to have seen a vision of the future," he said. "Can you tell us what you saw and why you believe it's happening now?" Sarah took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the edges of her notebook. "I know this sounds unbelievable," she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "But I drowned in the river a few weeks ago. While I was gone, I saw something terrifying. The Watchers showed me a future where the world is falling apart. Fires, floods, destruction everywhere. They said it's because of us, because of the way we've treated the planet. She opened the notebook, holding up one of the sketches. I drew this right after I came back. It's a flood swallowing a city. And now look at this. She pulled out her phone, showing the photo of the recent flooding. This is happening right now. The watchers said it's only going to get worse if we don't change. David nodded, his expression neutral but attentive. And you believe this is connected to specific decisions being made by world leaders? Yes, Sarah said firmly. The watchers showed me people in power who are ignoring the warnings, who are making it worse. Trump was one of them. They showed him signing policies that accelerated the destruction. But it's not just him, it's all of us. Every time we choose convenience over responsibility, we're pushing the world closer to the edge. The room was silent as Sarah finished speaking, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. David turned to the camera, his professional demeanor intact. You've heard her story, he said. Now it's up to you to decide what to believe. As the cameras cut, Sarah let out a shaky breath, her heart pounding. She didn't know if it would be enough, but she had done everything she could. Now all she could do was wait and hope. The broadcast aired that evening, just before the station's main news segment. Sarah and her mother sat huddled on the couch, the glow of the TV washing over them as they waited in silence. Linda had made tea, but neither of them touched it. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of Sarah's words hanging over them like a storm cloud. When the segment began, Sarah's stomach churned. Seeing herself on the screen, speaking with such urgency and passion, felt surreal. The camera lingered on her notebook, her sketches, the evidence she had shown. David's voiceover was calm and professional, giving just enough weight to her story without veering into sensationalism. As the segment ended, Linda reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. You did it, she said softly. Now we just have to wait. But waiting was the hardest part. Sarah felt like every second was an eternity, her mind racing with doubts. What if no one believed her? What if they laughed at her, dismissed her as just a kid with an overactive imagination? The first notification on her phone came 10 minutes later. Then another. And another. Her social media accounts, once quiet and largely ignored, were now lighting up with comments and messages. Some were supportive, others dismissive, and a few were downright cruel. She scrolled through the messages, her heart sinking with each one that called her a liar or an attention seeker. But then, among the noise, she found a comment that stopped her in her tracks. I saw them too. The watchers. You're not alone. Sarah's breath caught. She stared at the comment, reading it over and over again. Could it be real? Could someone else have experienced what she had? Mom, she said, her voice trembling. Look at this. Linda leaned over, squinting at the screen. What does it mean? She asked. It means I'm not crazy, Sarah said, her voice breaking. Someone else has seen them. Before she could reply to the comment, her phone buzzed with a call. The number was unfamiliar, but something told her to answer it. She hesitated for a moment before swiping to accept. Hello, she said, her voice cautious. Is this Sarah? The voice on the other end was deep and measured, with a faint accent she couldn't place. Yes, she said slowly. Who is this? My name is Dr. Elias Vance, the man said. I'm an environmental scientist. I saw your segment, and I believe you. Sarah's heart raced. You do? She asked, her voice filled with both hope and disbelief. Yes, he said firmly. What you described, the watchers, the visions, it aligns with something my team has been researching for years. We've seen patterns, signs of ecological collapse, but no one's been willing to listen. Your story could change that. Sarah glanced at her mother, who was watching her intently. What do you need from me? She asked. I want to meet, Dr. Vance said. There are things I can show you, evidence that supports what you've seen. But more importantly, I think we can work together to get people to listen. Sarah hesitated, the weight of his words sinking in. This was what she had been waiting for, someone who believed her, who could help her turn the prophecy into action. But it also felt overwhelming, like the stakes had just been raised to an unimaginable level. Okay, she said finally. When and where? Dr. Vance gave her the details, and they arranged to meet the next morning. As Sarah hung up the phone, She felt a strange mix of fear and determination. This was it. The Watchers had chosen her for a reason, and now it was time to fulfill that purpose. The next day, Sarah and Linda arrived at a small research lab on the outskirts of the city. The building was nondescript, its gray walls blending into the overcast sky. But as they stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air was filled with the hum of computers, the faint scent of chemicals, and the soft murmur of voices. Dr. Vance greeted them in the lobby, a tall man with graying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. He shook Sarah's hand firmly, his grip warm and reassuring. "It's an honor to meet you," he said. "You're braver than most adults I know." Sarah blushed, unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she said quietly. He led them into a small conference room, where a projector was set up. As they took their seats, he began to speak. "What you saw, Sarah, is something my team has been studying for years," he said, his tone serious. "The environmental collapse you described, it's not just a possibility. It's already happening. And the Watchers, well, let's just say you're not the first to report seeing them." Sarah leaned forward, her heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Dr. Vance clicked a button, and a series of images appeared on the screen. They showed sketches and descriptions eerily similar to Sarah's: shadowy figures with burning eyes, landscapes consumed by fire and water. "These accounts go back decades," he explained. "People all over the world have reported seeing beings like the ones you described. Some call them angels, others call them something else. But they always appear during times of great change, plagues, wars, environmental disasters. It's as if they're watching, waiting to see how we respond." Sarah stared at the images, a chill running down her spine. "So they're real," she whispered. Dr. Vance nodded. "I believe they are. And I believe they chose you for a reason." Linda reached over and took Sarah's hand, her grip steady and reassuring. "What do we do now?" she asked. Dr. Vance's expression hardened. "We fight," he said. "We use your story, your vision, to wake people up. If they won't listen to scientists, maybe they'll listen to you." Sarah swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling on her shoulders. The Watchers had given her a terrifying gift, and now it was up to her to use it. The world seemed to hold its breath as Sarah's story began to gain traction. The broadcast had gone viral, spreading across social media like wildfire. People were talking about the Watchers, about the prophecy, about Sarah herself. News outlets picked up the story, some treating it as a curiosity, others digging deeper. And as more people came forward with their own visions and experiences, the narrative began to shift. But not everyone was convinced. Detractors dismissed Sarah as a fraud, a child seeking attention. Political pundits accused her of fearmongering. And then there was Trump. The former president had been uncharacteristically silent on the matter, until now. A live press conference was announced, one that promised to address the growing hysteria surrounding the so-called prophet of doom. Sarah and her mother watched from their living room, the tension in the air almost unbearable. Trump stepped up to the podium, flanked by advisors and security personnel. His expression was stern, his tone measured, but there was a familiar glint of disdain in his eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we are living in a time of great uncertainty. But let me be clear, we will not be ruled by fear. This girl, this Sarah, is nothing more than a pawn in a larger game, a game designed to undermine our faith in the systems that keep our world strong." Sarah's chest tightened as she listened, her hands gripping the edge of the couch. She had expected him to dismiss her, but hearing it was still a blow. "Let me remind you," Trump continued, "that this is not the first time doomsayers have tried to predict the end of the world. And yet, here we are, stronger than ever. The United States will not bow to hysteria, and I assure you, we will continue to prioritize progress and prosperity." He ended with a smirk, the room erupting in applause. But as the cameras zoomed in, Sarah noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. His eyes. For a split second, they seemed to flicker, a flash of something otherworldly, something she recognized all too well. The fiery gaze of the Watchers. The revelation shook Sarah to her core. Could it be possible? Could Trump himself be one of them? Or worse, influenced by them? The Watchers had always been silent in her visions, their motives unclear. But if they were capable of taking sides, of manipulating leaders, she couldn't finish the thought. The implications were too terrifying. That night, as she lay in bed, her mind racing, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an anonymous message, sent through an encrypted app she didn't even remember downloading. "You're closer than you think. Meet me tomorrow. Alone. Coordinates attached." Her heart pounded as she read the message. It was risky, potentially dangerous. But something told her this was important. This was her chance to uncover the truth. The next day, Sarah made her way to the location, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified in the eerie silence. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. A figure emerged from the shadows, cloaked in a long coat and a hood that obscured their face. They moved with an unsettling grace, their voice low and resonant. "You've seen them," the figure said. "The Watchers?" "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "Who are they? What do they want?" The figure hesitated, then pulled back the hood, revealing a face that was both human and hot. The eyes burned with the same fire she had seen in her visions, but there was a sadness there, a weariness. "They are us," the figure said, "a future version of humanity, twisted by greed and hubris. The Watchers are not here to save you. They are here to judge." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Judge? Judge what?" "Whether your world is worth saving," the figure replied. "Whether you've learned from your mistakes or if you are destined to repeat them." Tears filled Sarah's eyes. "And Trump? Is he one of you?" The figure's expression darkened. "He is a puppet," they said. "A tool of chaos, designed to distract and divide. But he is not the cause of your destruction. That lies with all of you." Sarah's legs felt like jelly, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. "Then why me?" she asked. "Why show me the visions?" "Because you are the tipping point. Your voice has the power to sway the balance, to make people see what they've ignored for too long." Before she could respond, the figure stepped back into the shadows, their presence vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Sarah stood there, her heart pounding, the weight of their words pressing down on her like 1,000 stones. The next morning, Sarah called an emergency press conference. The world needed to hear the truth, not just about the Watchers, but about themselves. She stood at the podium, her voice trembling but resolute. "We are running out of time," she said. "The Watchers are not saviors. They are judges. And their judgment will not be kind unless we change, now." Her words sent shockwaves across the globe. Protests erupted, leaders scrambled to address the growing unrest, and people began to question everything they had taken for granted. And then the sky changed. It was subtle at first, a faint glow, like an aurora borealis spreading across the horizon. But as the hours passed, the light intensified, casting an eerie, otherworldly hue over the world. People stared in awe and terror, their disbelief giving way to the chilling realization that Sarah had been right all along. The Watchers had arrived. Sarah stood with her mother, watching the skies from their backyard. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing. This was only the beginning. The world's fate was no longer in her hands. It was in everyone's. The end, or perhaps the true beginning, had arrived.